I'd like to introduce Dr. Philip Mansel, our speaker. I'm Peter James and I'm the chairman of the Friends of Czech Heritage. But first of all, I must say how very grateful we are to the ambassador and her staff for welcoming us to the embassy, and especially to the first secretary, Martin Hošek. I have to say that introducing the speaker is somewhat a daunting task, for he's published so much and so widely and is so involved in so many initiatives. But as a historian, he seems to me to have two main areas of interest, which are the history of France, particularly I think the 17th, 18th, and perhaps early 19th centuries, can be corrected there, and the Ottoman Empire. He studied at Oxford University and at University College London, and has published many books. And if you've been onto Wikipedia, as I have, there's a very, very long list, and they all look fascinating. His Life of Louis XIV looms large, and his list of publications is matched by many others dealing with French history up to the Revolution and after. And the history of the Levant under the Ottomans runs in parallel with an equal number of publications. But as I pondered this output, I wondered where the crossovers between the two themes might be and how the duality was sustained academically. It seems to be a remarkable achievement. Finally, I also noticed way down in the Wikipedia entry his interest in what is called the Kimmeridge project. Kimmeridge is on the Dorset coast, and in particular, he is responsible for having got help the Landmark Trust to move the Clavel Tower. If you're a Landmark Trust supporter, you will know the Clavel Tower, which was moved about 20 yards or so to avoid it being sort of washed away down a cliff into the sea. I think as far as the Friends of Czech Heritage are concerned, there's a question mark about moving historic buildings. And it's a dangerous and divisive subject, but I don't want to talk about that tonight. So anyhow, can you please welcome our speaker, and we must get on with the talk. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. And I'm talking tonight about a European subject. I forget which historian said there is no history of Germany, there is only the history of Europe. And I think that also applies to Czechia or Bohemia, and indeed to France and the Austrian monarchy in general. And dominating the life of Louis XIV, who is shown here, painted by Uas in 1679, was his rivalry with the House of Austria, ruling from Silesia to the Dalmatian coast. Many wars from the 1670s on, occasional partition plans of Spain, but Austria is always the enemy, often represented as humiliated at the foot of statues of Louis XIV. Here now, how do I move the pictures? Anyway, French influence, it's not moving. French influence in Czech lands was rather small compared to, rather slight compared to Italian influence there. And, yeah, okay, thank you. Here he is again, represented as a Roman emperor, a rival to the Holy Roman Emperor before one of the many Dutch towns which he conquered, to the fury of the Habsburgs, in particular Strasbourg in 1682. So this rivalry goes on. His most bitter, here is the map of Europe. You see France on the left, and in dark green, the Habsburg monarchy. Two huge land masses naturally at war with each other. This is Louis's enemy, Leopold I, the Holy Roman Emperor. He's dressed partly in rivalry of Louis XIV, showing that he too is a party-loving monarch. It's for a Baroque ballet, 1667, by Jan Thomas. Always this rivalry between the House of Austria and the House of France for control of Europe and the future of the Spanish monarchy, which Louis grabs. And here is Louis's most bitter personal enemy, a former courtier, Prince Eugene of Savoy, the hero of the Austrian monarchy, victor over the French army in 1708, 9, 10, the son of a former favourite of Louis XIV, somebody who knew and loathed Louis XIV. So, in a way, the upper and lower Belvedere, which he built in Vienna, are sort of a long revenge against Versailles. But you see the style of the great Baroque portrait is rather similar to Louis XIV. And this rivalry goes on. Louis XV, shown here giving peace to Europe as a young man about 1730. His great project was to put the House of Bavaria, to whom he was related, because his grandmother was a Bavarian princess, on the throne of the Holy Roman Empire, and as kings of Bohemia, to which they had a very spurious hereditary claim, the Elector of Bavaria. And this is his general, the Maréchal de Belle-Isle. In the War of the Austrian Succession after 1740, he leads French armies even to Prague. 1741, 1742, they are putting the Elector of Bavaria as King of Bohemia. Here he is, Charles VII, briefly Holy Roman Emperor. It was a disaster for France. It was a disaster for Bavaria. It didn't really work. House of Austria is far stronger. But if you go to Nymphenburg, the stables, which I deeply recommend, that has more saddles and bridles and bits and pieces than I've ever seen in my life. You see quoted his letter next to his coronation coach saying, "I had the finest coronation anybody's ever seen or heard of." I mean, so that's his rivalry with the Austrians. But after 1756, there is a change. There is the reversal of alliances. France and Austria become allies. Here is the famous royal marriage of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. The two countries fight together against Prussia, and one of the symbols of the alliance is Charles-Joseph de Lamoral, Prince de Ligne, who is a symbol also of 18th century Europe and the Europe of courts. Quote, "You lose respect in a country you inhabit all the time. I like my condition of being a foreigner everywhere, German in France, French in Austria, Walloon in the army. His family is from the southern Netherlands. He is an officer in the Austrian army, and he is a French writer, publishing endlessly in French in Paris, and knowing everyone, going everywhere, a favourite of Marie Antoinette, of Catherine the Great, of Frederick the Great, of Maria Theresa, of Joseph II, to whom he is a chamberlain, one of the 35 of 1,000 chamberlains whom the emperor kept for his personal service, and related to everybody also. And a very original thinker, he wrote, "The only pleasure of marriage is to be delivered from your own relations. One has a wife like one has a regiment, a government office to have." And he believed there should be property rights for women, an inheritance tax to benefit hospitals, and that one day he prophesied the French Revolution. "The people is like a horse. It allows itself to be ridden because it does not know its own strength." And he's a professional writer, and he knows the Rohans. He's a friend of the Rohans, who will be coming to later, who also move to Bohemia, like many other French nobles, as a result of the revolution. And he called, when the Prince de Rohan Guéméné, it becomes a bankrupt in 1782, ruining many of his creditors in Paris, and he calls it the most serene bankruptcy. and he writes to him, I want to erect you like a ruin in my garden, since ruins were so fashionable. So he's very much part of this world. Here he is at the time of the French Revolution, and in my opinion, this shows he was flirting with Belgian nationalism, because it says, not afraid to die for your country, per patria, and that patria may have been Belgium briefly, not the Austrian monarchy, of which he was a marshal, a general, a diplomat, and so on. And 1789, he moves to Vienna. He's a writer. Here he is living in Vienna, writing and reading every morning. And every summer, like half of Europe, or those who could afford it, he would go to Teplitz in Bohemia, because his son-in-law, Prince Clary, was the owner of the waters at Teplitz. And it was natural to move around. Another family that moved from France to Bohemia was the Puyi family. We'll be coming to them later. Exile wasn't, as is often said, a constant source of engagement and exclusion. For many people, exile was a career opportunity. Ligne, for example, did very well in the Austrian army, becoming a marshal and captain of the guard. Austria was the House of Lords of Europe. It has been estimated that a third of the 460 noble families of the Habsburg court nobility had their main estates in Bohemia. It was rich and it was attractive. Many nobles were efficient landowners with coal, glass brewing and other industries. Prague was a city of 200 palaces, as many of you know well. And the Clary themselves were partly of French origin. That's another French connection. The Aldringhams came from Lorraine. They owned Teplitz. Following a fire in 1793, Prince Clary restored the family schloss in Teplitz. He built hotels, bathhouses, the first neo-Gothic church in Bohemia, a theatre, a temple, and a Turkish pavilion. In 1801, the English philosopher Henry Crabb Robinson wrote, "As he derives great profit from the bathing guests, he is interested in making the town attractive. In his palace is a small but very handsome theatre. His gardens are open to the public, and himself and family distinguish themselves by their courtesy and affability." And part of that affability is the Prince de Ligne, his father-in-law, who is welcoming guests, attracting guests, putting on amateur theatricals, and so on, in the great Rococo concert hall in this palace, which you can see to this day, and it still has a Prince de Ligne room in the palace. And opposite it is this hotel, which, if you look carefully, is called the Hotel Prince de Ligne. French Revolution, Spa, the main spa of Western Europe, is out of action because it's under the French Republic. So naturally, all the more guests go to Teplitz and later Marienbad and Carlsbad. Princess Louise of Prussia, a niece of Frederick the Great, writes in her memoirs, "On the very evening of the day we arrived there, the Prince de Ligne came to beg us to join their circle in the hall, where all the visitors to the baths met." All the visitors, so it was really quite open. Billiards, card games, concerts, and so on. And in 1803, it received a visit from the exiled Queen of France, the wife of the exiled Louis XVIII, and Ligne wrote, "She's better than 20 years ago when she was obliged to behave well. Her small household is exactly right, neither splendid nor miserable. She is really an excellent woman, this queen, kind, gay, easy to live with, easy to amuse, grateful for the least thing one does for her." Although he also added, "Since she's scratched a lot, she has the face and gestures of a monkey." And Teplitz was a sort of counter-revolutionary centre, like the whole of Austria, like Vienna, long before the Congress of Vienna. And they built above it this structure, which I missed when I went there, called Ligne, a hexagonal temple on a hill outside Teplitz with mirrors and sofas, and it was inaugurated in 1805 by a mock coronation of the Prince de Ligne to parody that of Napoleon a year earlier in Notre Dame. And he appointed grand dignitaries, and like those of the French Empire, and 20 guests sang couplets in his honour. And the Rohans are there, and one of the most surprising visitors was Casanova, another example of the French connections of Bohemia. He's a librarian to the Count Waldstein next door at Dux. He comes to visit Ligne a lot, and of course they speak in French, and Casanova wrote his memoirs in French, and Ligne was at his best with him, correcting them, encouraging him, giving readings from each other's works, sharing their horror of the French Republic. Casanova called Ligne one of the few men who had learned to despise flattery. I'm not so sure about that. He compared Ligne's style to a jumping flea, un puce qui saute. And Ligne would read Casanova's memoirs section by section, saying they made him either laugh, think, or have an erection. And his italicisms in his French, Ligne encouraged him to keep. He was completely original. They have more force than ridiculous French grammar. And they both had publishers in Dresden, which was then a centre of French language publishing. And the letters survive between the two. The envelope would be written by Ligne to Casanova. À Monsieur Casanova, bibliothécaire de Monsieur le Comte de Waldstein, à Dux, près Teplitz, par Prague. And the Bohemian postmen were expected to know French, and I'm sure they did. And then there were many other visitors, the whole Courland family, the richest heiresses in Europe, the 4 beautiful princesses of Courland came to Teplitz, and Ligne inevitably wrote a poem about their love affairs. Le sang auguste de Courland ne souffre point d'amour la contrebande. The august blood of Courland will not have a substitute for love, and so on. Here is the countryside round Teplitz, another view of Montligne, Dux or Duchkov near Teplitz, where Casanova lived and died. And this is Princess Wilhelmina of Courland and her lover, Count Armfelt, known as the Alcibiades of the North, because he pleased so many people of both sexes. And even Armfelt, who had done everything with everybody, was shocked by Teplitz. He called it Sodom and Gomorrah. So really this was an extraordinary centre for French culture in Bohemia, and a reminder that national identity wasn't the only identity at that time. There was also French culture and language uniting Europe. Here is a wonderful Gérard portrait of Princess Pauline of Schwarzenberg at Orlik, a reminder that the Schwarzenbergs were ambassadors in Paris under Napoleon, and later, this is Prince Schwarzenberg, who is later commander-in-chief of the Allied army, Austrian, Prussian and Russian, which defeated Napoleon. It's often forgotten. Napoleon was fairly frequently defeated. He won the Battle of the Nations at Leipzig, near Bohemia. And here is the Prince de Ligne later, 1812, he's in Prague, always spending time in Bohemia. He goes there to visit the Empress Marie-Louise, who Napoleon has gone on to invade Russia, with the results we know. Marie-Louise pays a visit to her family in Prague and is painted by a Frenchman, Isabelle. Here she is again. And here is this great European victory over Napoleon, you see you see Schwarzenberg in a white uniform on a white horse. This is by Kraft. It's a deliberate reply to Napoleon's grandiloquent battle pictures. Here the three Allied monarchs are humbly standing on the ground, not on their horses. The Tsar Alexander I, the centre of the three, the Emperor Francis I of Austria, father-in-law and conqueror of Napoleon, and Frederick William III, King of Prussia. And they also often met at Teplitz in the years 1813 to 14, and in fact later. It's a natural meeting place for Europe. And here is the Congress of Vienna, also by Isabelle, a very famous representation of Europe. And of course the Prince de Ligne, just before he died, said the Congress doesn't advance but it dances. And then he said he was going to organize his death in order to give heaven news of the Congress. So Teplitz recovers its European role, and the Rohans have now moved to Bohemia. This is Prince Jules Armand Louis, Prince de Rohan. In my opinion, one reason why they were so keen to live in Bohemia is that the vast debts from before the revolution had still, in some cases, not been paid. So they got somehow the means to buy Sychrov. Here is another French noble who has become an Austrian. This is Emmanuel von Mensdorff-Pouilly. He's given the command of the Galician regiment of Uhland's Erzherzog Karl. He's a commander in these wars of 1813 to 14 in Bohemia, and he marries a Coburg princess. So he is in fact uncle by marriage of Queen Victoria. And another example of a French family becoming Bohemian nobles. And now so Metternich is running the affairs of the world from partly from his Bohemian castle Kinswart, and 1830 there is a revolution in Paris. The Austrian government thought Charles X was going to win, but he didn't. He's overthrown. He goes to Lulworth in Dorset, then Holyrood in Edinburgh, and then finally, at the invitation of the Emperor of Austria, he moves to the castle in Prague, to the Hradčin. And this is arranged by this fine gentleman, Casimir Duc de Blacas, who is his advisor and a friend of Metternich. And I think they arranged this, so the Bourbons, having been previously the enemies of the Habsburgs in the 19th century, they're part of the great conservative monarchical front. Blacas and Metternich get on. Metternich gives Blacas and the Bourbons special rights in the Austrian Empire, so they're not subject to Austrian law, they're a law unto themselves. And from 1832 to 1836, the Bourbons live in the castle in Prague. And here is a picture of Charles X in the last year of his life by Paulin Guérin. He really, on the right, he really looks the image of an exiled monarch at the end of his tether. On the left is the most famous writer of his day, Chateaubriand, who twice visits Prague on missions from French royalists to Charles X, the exiled monarch. And I would like to quote from some of his writings. And Charles X, he immediately becomes friends with the Rohans, whom he knew from before the revolution anyway, and he goes hunting in Sychrov and elsewhere. The memoirs of the inspector of the Hradčin still survive, called Arnos Rudolf, and he says how difficult it is satisfying the French courtiers. There would have been at least 100 people, perhaps more, serving Charles X, his son, the Duc d'Angoulême, his daughter-in-law, the Duchesse d'Angoulême, the child of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, and his grandson, the Duc de Bordeaux, later known as the Comte de Chambord. Anyway, Chateaubriand is rather amazed by Prague. Let me quote. In Charles X, the man drew tears to my eyes, the monarch wounded me. I let myself go to these two impressions as long as they succeeded each other, without being able to reconcile them. And he's rather shocked that the summer residence is Bucherad, I don't know if that still survives, outside Prague, which belonged to the Grand Duke of Tuscany, proof that the Grand Duke of Tuscany regarded himself as just a tenant in Florence. He kept property in the Austrian monarchy. And some of the furniture the royal family used in Prague, they'd used previously in Holyrood in Scotland. They moved around with their own furniture because the Habsburg emperors didn't furnish all their palaces at the same time, unlike the kings of France. Oh, my old king, your sleep is painful. Time and adversity, heavy nightmares have placed themselves on your chest. I'm translating from Chateaubriand's French. A young man would approach the bed of his young wife with less love than I felt of respect as I advanced towards your solitary seat. At least I was not a bad dream come to wake you up, to tell you that your son was dying. And so on and so forth. Let this bed of exile last as long as possible until it receives the visit of God. 20th of September, Henri V, he and many Frenchmen regarded this prince living in Prague as Henri V, the successor of Henri IV. He asks to see Chateaubriand, and he tells him about the loyalty of the French royalists who want to offer him spurs of gold. And there's much more in these lines. There's an Austrian guard of honor guarding the King of France in exile in Prague. Charles X is still corresponding with what he calls my government in Paris. I thank the king for appointing me to his government, admiring the illusions of this world. When society is collapsing, when monarchies are ending, when the whole world is being renewed, Charles X in Prague establishes a government in France. But let's mock him too much. Which of us doesn't have the chimera? Which of us doesn't give cause for mockery? Which of us doesn't have the secret passions? These memoirs that I am writing, this is Chateaubriand speaking, are they not my illusion, my form of vanity? Don't I believe that I'm seriously speaking to the future, which is as little at my disposition as France was at the orders of Charles X? It's very magnificent prose, one of the great memoirs of the 19th century. He's trying to make legitimist monarchy understood by the future, and he says, in his opinion, monarchy is the easiest way to complete freedom. He's completely horrified by the Republic and the Revolution, which he'd seen at first hand, and he and his aged wife spent a lot of their old age looking after victims of the Revolution, priests and nuns. And then there are quarrels, of course, in the exile government in Prague between relatively liberal people and the reactionaries who are led by the Duc de Blacas, who in fact was hated by most royalists. Chateaubriand called him the undertaker of the monarchy. He had a long white face like an undertaker at a funeral procession. But he was highly intelligent. He got this deal with Metternich, and this year there's going to be an exhibition on Champollion and the decipherment of the hieroglyphs in Paris. And he was the main patron of Champollion in the 1820s in France. Anyway, everybody's sort of going up and down the corridors of the Hradschin, hissing at each other and bowing to each other. The immense chateau of the kings of Bohemia, which he compares to the Vatican or the Temple in Jerusalem. Charles X says to him, good morning, Monsieur de Chateaubriand. I'm delighted to see you. In fact, he hated Chateaubriand because Chateaubriand had led a campaign against censorship before 1830. You shouldn't have come this evening. You must be very tired. Don't stay standing. Please sit down. How is your wife? And so on and so forth. Nothing breaks the heart more than the simplicity of words in those who are in the highest positions of society and the great catastrophes of life. In fact, Chateaubriand cries because Charles X was in exile and in a very bad health and very bad condition. He said, Prague is a delightful city where 25 to 30 towers and church towers are like pyramids going up. Its architecture reminds me of a city of the Renaissance. He liked the Moldau, he liked the countryside, he likes, above all, seeing Henri V, because they really thought he was the future of France. This is the king, this is the man who, in old age, would refuse the throne of France in 1870 because he would not accept the tricolour. I mean, he's already being brought up in very reactionary ideas. This is him drawn by his tutor, Monsieur Dardivillers, who was a great uncle of General de Gaulle. So French monarchism was a very strong force in the 19th century. A lot of people came to Prague to salute him. Above all, Metternich didn't want there to be conspiracies against Louis Philippe launched from Prague. That is why Blacas was watching everybody. But Henri V already had some pretty strange ideas, and the memoirs of another of his tutors, called the Marquis d'Opole, survive. He would walk the streets of Prague, and this young prince of 13 would hit people who didn't salute him respectfully enough, according to his own tutor. So you can imagine what he was like. And Charles X and his son, the Duc d'Angoulême, would also walk the streets of Prague without any attendants or guards, just with umbrellas, very simply, rather like their cousin Louis Philippe in France. And one of his tutors was called Joachim Barrand, and he's a great geologist, and I want to read you some descriptions of him, because he's a founder of Bohemian geology. He came to Prague in 1832. He'd already been teaching the prince in the Tuileries in public. He becomes a friend of František Palacký, the great Czech scholar, who actually teaches German to Henri V. So there's a lot of contact between the royal family and Prague, and there are New Year receptions where everybody goes to salute the Bourbons, and some of the royalists would go to the receptions of Count Chotek, who is the Grand Burgrave of Bohemia. And this man, Joachim Barrand, spends a lot of time looking for fossils and rewriting the geology of Bohemia in the 1830s and 40s, and even later. He's working on the calculation of costs and profitability of the horse railway from Budovici to Linz, and so on. He knows the Sternbergs, he knows Professor Zipper, custodian of the natural history collections in the museum. He's the author of the Survey of Geology of Bohemia, all this in German. He was acknowledged many times during his life by Czech professors for his bequest to the Czech nation, to the Museum of Prague. He has a large commemorative plate with his name on the present-day Baron Rock on the river Vltava in Prague. Deep respect to this honoured personality. The plaque was unveiled in 1884, and rather appropriately for a legitimist royalist geologist, he did not believe in evolution like Darwin. He had what is called the catastrophe theory of the development of the world. Deeply devoted to the Bourbons, he refused to become a member of the Académie Française in France. He was a true Christian. He went every Sunday to St. Nicholas Church in Prague. He had a housekeeper. His bearing to women was always courtly and gentle. He could not conceal his French origin in this respect. He didn't like it when his housekeeper left home to go shopping. He regularly reminded her, "Do come back soon, otherwise I would feel lonely." And the neighbours said he was a Frenchman who spent all his time buried in books and collecting stones. And his one housekeeper was Jan Neruda's mother, Mrs. Barbara Nerudova, who kept care of him till 1853, and she taught him Czech. So he's living there, and with Henri V, who's in Austria at the same time, throughout the 19th century. He knew Jan Neruda. And nobody as yet has seriously analysed how Barrande influenced Neruda. Neruda, according to O. Matusek, has so many French features that it could hardly be without Barrande's influence. And I suspect this French influence on foreign writers has always been underestimated, including for English writers. It's underestimated or just forgotten, maybe. Anyway, there is this group of French people annoying Louis Philippe's police, living in Prague Castle. There is Chambord in old age. The Duc de Bordeaux had become Comte de Chambord. At the time, he refuses the throne of France in 1871. And among the friends with whom they would go hunting or go to parties were the Rohans of Sychrov. And the Rohans owed the rise to fame and power not just to the antiquity of the family, but above all to the favour of the Princess de Rohan and de Rohan-Chabot, Princess de Soubise, shown here, who is one of Louis XIV's innumerable mistresses. And it was said that when her husband was away, she would wear emerald earrings. And so the king knew the coast was clear. There she is again. This was the magnificent house in Paris, built in the reign of Louis XIV, probably from his presents and gifts and favours and the offices he gave to everybody. And then here is Sychrov, which they get, which some of you have been to, as I have. What wonderful castle. They get it in 1820. Again, showing how Europe functioned. They could adapt relatively easily to life as Austrian nobles, having been French and Breton nobles for about 1,000 years. Here are some of the wonderful portraits in Sychrov, in really very good condition. About 200 French royal and aristocratic portraits. There was a special suite for Charles X and his family when they came to stay for hunting. These are very familiar copies of portraits of Louis XIV and Louis XV. Here it is again. This is a Prince de Rohan who becomes an honorary citizen of Prague. They're already quite popular. And 1836, the royal family leaves Prague because Ferdinand, the first Emperor of Austria is going to be crowned King of Bohemia as Ferdinand V, King of Bohemia. So there'll be no, as the entire Austrian court is moving to Prague, there'll be no room for the Bourbons. And this is a picture of the coronation, 7th of September 1836, by Leopold in Prague Castle. You see the many splendid uniforms, and I would like to quote from the really incredible description of the coronation by the Comte de Saint-Hilaire, French ambassador. So the French ambassador of Louis Philippe is moving to Prague. He could not possibly see the Bourbons of the elder branch. The 19th century, as I hope this shows, was a century of coronations as well as revolutions, more than ever before or since, over 30. And Ferdinand is the last person to have had 3 coronations: King of Hungary, King of Bohemia, and later King of Lombardy Venetia in Milan. Saint-Hilaire writes in his memoirs, "The ceremony was magnificent and remarkable, above all for the flavour of the past which it kept." And one feature was, unfortunately there's no picture of it, the Queen of Bohemia, his wife Mariana, wasn't crowned by a man. She's crowned by the Abbess of Prague, who is an archduchess. And all the offices at the coronation were performed by women, or the wives of the male officers. The right to crown the Queen belongs to the Abbess of Prague. No man was admitted in the choir of the church. The grand officers of the crown are represented by their women, if they have one. If they don't have one, the Grand Burgrave of Bohemia gives them one for that occasion. He chooses them among the most beautiful ladies of the high nobility, and in 1836 there was an embarras de choix. So the Queen of Bohemia looked absolutely marvellous as she entered the church of the Hradčin, preceded by the female grand officers of the crown, all dressed in ancient Bohemian costume. The dresses and cloaks, of course, were sparkling with jewels. The constable was, the part of constable was played by a young princess of Lobkowitz, who held with her 2 hands a naked sword, and all her companions carried on cushions the insignia of their offices. So it's an entirely female ceremony, and this is another example, like many others, that court society and monarchies, in fact, gave a vast arena to women, far greater than representative assemblies until living memory. And around the church were the wives of plain gentlemen and notable bourgeois of Prague and the provinces. Everyone agreed in the diplomatic corps, who had seen many other ceremonies, the ceremonies of Napoleon, of Russia and so on, that they had never seen anything so curious or so magnificent. And this ceremony went on despite the fact there was a cholera epidemic going on. The Queen insisted on being crowned as Queen of Bohemia. And Saint-Hilaire concludes his description by saying, "Of all the ceremonies I have been present at in my life, those of Prague in 1836 were the most remarkable." And there was a procession with peasants wearing the livery of their lords, and what struck him was the entire absence of distrust between classes. This is a foreign diplomat writing, perhaps he's exaggerating, but he said compared to the later coronation ceremonies of the same monarch he saw in Milan, the atmosphere was far better in Prague. And I thought this ceremony might not be familiar to specialists of the history of Bohemia. I've never seen it described elsewhere. You see Ferdinand, who was very popular later in Prague. He abdicated, and his brilliant, promising, dynamic, brave, military nephew, Franz Josef, succeeded. But when Franz Josef suffered defeat after defeat and made mistake after mistake, Ferdinand, who is living in Prague and in a castle in countryside, he said, "Oh, I could have done that." So perhaps the simpleton, he had various diseases, but perhaps the simpleton wasn't such a bad ruler after all. Anyway, he certainly signed fewer death warrants than Franz Josef. He didn't start a world war either. This is another picture of the coronation. He was called Ferdinand Dobrotivy, or Ferdinand the Benignant, the Benign. And his wife was extremely popular because of her charities, and she inspired the Beliebte Annen polka by Johann Strauss. And here is a picture of the coronation banquet in the palace. And so coronations were important. 1871, Franz Josef promises to be crowned king of Bohemia, but he backtracks, and it's not quite certain why. Possibly because of pressure from Hungarians. He'd been crowned king of Hungary, and they didn't want a rival. Possibly pressure from German Bohemians. I'm not quite certain. Anyway, this begins the rupture between Bohemia and the Habsburgs, and some Czechs printed his coronation promise, his promise to be crowned king of Bohemia, on paper which was later used for purposes I don't say, well, for the lavatory. And this is all explained in a museum of the Habsburgs outside Prague. This showed what they thought of him, and this gradually distancing between the Habsburgs and some Czechs, but by no means all. Prince Schwarzenberg, a great Bohemian noble, he saves the monarchy in 1848, but he dies. He's the prime minister who Franz Josef respected most, but he dies in 1852. If he had survived, maybe Bismarck would not have won the diplomatic duel with Austria. And the international role of Bohemia goes on. Teplitz becomes unfashionable. It is replaced by Karlsbad and Marienbad, and Marienbad really is the centre of Europe in the summer, when everybody goes there, even Clemenceau. You can see on the left Edward VII. There's a whole book about his visits to Marienbad. He sees Franz Josef. He goes there 9 times, 7 of them as king, and he gets to know in Marienbad, in the informality of a great Bohemian spa, MPs, people like Henry Campbellman, whom he couldn't get to know so easily in London and England. So it's not true what Chamberlain said about Bohemia being a faraway country of which we know nothing. Actually, a lot of English people knew it extremely well before 1914 and went there regularly. And I'd like to end with a last representative of French-speaking and international Bohemia, a grandson of a figure we've seen earlier, and he was Count Albert Mensdorff-Pouilly, of French stock, an Austrian noble. His father had been Prime Minister of Austria. He's Austrian ambassador in London. He owned the castle of Boscovici in Bohemia. He was very popular in London. And his departure on the 12th of August, really quite late 1914, was really the end of Austrian-English relations for a time. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I took away the serene bankruptcy. I thought that was a marvellous expression. Fantastic. I hope I never have to have a serene bankruptcy. You're happy to take some questions if people would like to have a question. Please, now's the time.
Philip, is there a painting of the coronation of Queen Mariana?
Not that I
or
found.
Any illustration?
Not that I found, but if there is one, I'll tell you. It seems incredible there isn't one, but maybe it was only for the emperor. I don't know.
You would be just so curious.
Yes.
It'd be fascinating.
It would have been a great moment for the Empress Elizabeth to show off. I think it's characteristically limited of Franz Josef not to have been crowned, not to have used that ceremony to reconnect to the Czechs.
Did many or any of the French nobility who spent a lot of time in the Czech lands, did they speak any of them Czech or even German?
I think Ligne spoke a few words of Czech and a few words of German, but not much more. I have never. The Rohans must have learned some Czech, but I've never heard of any of the emigrés learning Czech. I think they didn't even condescend to learn German on the whole. So many people spoke French. It was so easy to speak French, to get around with French. I think Barrand learned some Czech, the geologist. Yes.
The Bohemians, I met present Count in Italy with a family called Di Colalto, who are also deeply connected with Arabia, particularly. How does he fit into the Coburg family?
Okay.
How do they fit in?
Count de Pouilly marries Princess Sophia of Coburg, who is an elder sister of the future King Leopold of the Belgians and of Victoria, Duchess of Kent.
Right.
And so, and they just lived together in wherever he's stationed with his regiment and in Vienna. And then his son is a foreign minister and prime minister of Franz Josef. His grandson is the ambassador in London because he's a relation of the British royal family. Because he would in fact have been, I think, a second cousin of Edward VII.
I met head of the Order of Malta in Prague, which was the Maltese centre there. Thank you.
Philip, thank you very much indeed. It was most extremely interesting, and I like the way that the French aristocracy escaped their debts by going abroad and going home. I think it's very sensible. Huge debts that they left behind. So I take a leaf out of it. Maybe I have to take a leaf out of their books. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.